Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting the next panel of our conference. The main topic this panel will be the situation of Czech and Slovak Catholics, and as the first will be speaking Ms. Eva Vybíralová, Ph.D. from Institute for the Study of the Totalitarian Regimes in Prague, Ústav pro studium totalitních režimů. And topic of her presentation is ordinary faculties as an instrument of the Apostolic See to deal with the rise of communism. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I am Mrs. Vybíralová.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
No.
Thank you for the invitation to this conference. You may ask, what are the extraordinary faculties? We heard in the paper of Professor Latka about special powers for the Cardinal Hlond, and it's something similar. Extraordinary faculties refer to competencies under Catholic canon law according to the old Codex Juris Canonici from 1917. They were granted by the Apostolic See to the local authorities, usually nuncios, and then diocesan bishops or other ordinaries. The faculties included the competency to grant various dispensations, licenses, indults, and privileges. That is, exceptions to universal laws, not the laws issued by the bishop himself. These powers included all areas of church life: liturgy, sacraments, religious life, teaching and study of theology, etc. My presentation will analyze the development, effects, successes, and failures of these faculties in the Eastern Bloc, primarily after 1945. The special faculties had perhaps the greatest impact in Czechoslovakia, specifically the effect on the special development of the underground church, a phenomenon not occurring in other countries. Thanks to the making available of the Vatican archives from the times of the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, we can examine the text of the extraordinary papal faculties. Based on the experience of the church's persecution by the Bolshevik regime in Mexico, the Soviet Union, and Spain, the church expected further persecution in the countries occupied by the Soviet Union during and after World War II. So, local churches received such extraordinary faculties. In the Vatican Apostolic Archive, I found the text of the faculties for the war period for Latvia, Romania, and Turkey. But these faculties were most likely sent to the nunciature of the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. These special faculties were various Italian titles: Facoltà Specialissime, Facoltà Speciali, Facoltà Straordinarie, or Facoltá pro tempore belli. These papal faculties for the war period were issued on the 3rd of November 1939, primarily for the Polish territory occupied by the Soviet Union. The faculties were determined to the bishops of Polish territories annexed by Russians, being both the Latin and the Eastern Rite bishops. The second set of extraordinary measures is dated 22 of May 1940, being again focused on the Polish occupied territories, and contains 4 parts of the text: for deported or otherwise persecuted priests of Latin and Eastern rites, and also for the bishops of Latin and Eastern rites. These faculties and instructions made, for example, the following provisions: The diocesan bishops of relevant territories had to appoint 2 priests to ensure that in the event of being taken hostage, imprisoned, or for another reason impeded for communicating with the people in their dioceses, the jurisdiction of the diocesan bishop could be carried out nevertheless. These priests would also represent him in the episcopal office. Furthermore, ordinaries were allowed, for example, to permit an abbreviated form of the baptismal liturgy, to entrust selected priests to celebrate confirmations, to allow the reception of the Eucharist also in the hand, to grant the priests the necessary jurisdiction to hear confessions in the whole territory under a reign that was hostile to religion, or to allow priests as well as the faithful belonging to Eastern rites, now we speak about Ecclesia sui juris, to receive all sacraments in the Latin Church except ordination. Ordinaries could also validate marriages, dispense religious men from perpetual vows, and allow clerics to wear secular clothing. Ordinaries, for example, were able to allow priests to celebrate Mass without fasting, to assist at weddings with one witness, or even without witnesses in case the spouses were members of the Communist Party or of the army, if they were afraid to enter into an ecclesiastical marriage in the presence of witnesses. In case of the really persecution, priests of both rites were allowed to celebrate Mass without liturgical vestments, without candles and relics. They could use a chalice made of ordinary glass, etc. During the Second World War, some Roman congregations further expanded the list of special powers. For example, the Congregation for the Oriental Church allowed the ordinaries of places under Soviet rule to enable their priests to say masses in another Catholic rites than their own. This is so-called spiritualism. After the end of the war, some ordinaries received some special faculties. For example, Polish Cardinal Hlond used such powers in summer 1945. In August, he forced some German bishops in the new Polish territories to resign, and he himself appointed new apostolic administrators. Then he was accused of invalidating or interpreting extraordinary papal powers too broadly. The first question was, on which territory was he actually allowed to use the faculties? In Old or New Poland? In the documents is in Italiano, in tutto il territorio polacco. The second question was, he was himself really allowed to force bishops to resign? Or was he only allowed to appoint apostolic administrators for vacant dioceses? Anyway, in later Czechoslovak hidden church, around the sacred Bishop Felix Davidek, there was a belief that Hlond's successor, Cardinal Wyszynski, could himself appoint bishops throughout his territory. And now, extraordinary faculties in Czechoslovakia. In February 1948, the communists finally took over political power in Czechoslovakia. In anticipation of a similar destiny of the Czechoslovak Catholic Church as persecuted churches in other countries, Domenico Tardini from the Secretariat of State in Vatican sent in October 1948 a new document with extraordinary faculties to Prague International. The introduction to the document clearly states that the extraordinary faculties were in force only for the duration of the danger. The use of the faculties was subject to two conditions. One was the impossibility of correspondence with the Holy See by letters or telegrams. The other necessary condition for the use of the faculties was serious danger resulting from a delay. The recipient of the faculties, if prevented from exercising his office, could subdelegate the powers. Extraordinary faculties did not in any case apply to the following dispensations: from the obligation of priestly celibacy, from valid non-consummated marriage, from the impediment of affinity. It also regarded the possibility to appoint bishops, to grant the dispensation from canonical age by more than 18 months, from unfinished studies in case of priestly ordination, and to establish or change the statutes of dioceses and apostolic administrations. It was often said that the secret consecrations of bishops in Czechoslovakia took place precisely on the basis of extraordinary faculties, but it's not true. The bishops secretly consecrated in 1949 and 1950 were appointed in advance by the Apostolic See. Later episcopal consecrations usually took place without the prior approval of Vatican. The next. Sorry. And the next here. The Latin text of faculties numbers 18 pages in total, containing instructions for the management of the diocese and for ensuring continuous jurisdiction, faculties for ordinaries in cases of grave need, faculties for the deported, imprisoned, and persecuted priests of both rights. And for comparison, it also contains the so-called congregational faculties for the case of merely impaired. This is here. Here are also the Latin names, but too long. The extraordinary faculties spread very quickly among priests in the 1950s, and soon they began to be called Mexican faculties in Czechoslovakia, named after the persecution of the church in Mexico in the 20s. Unfortunately, they were very soon discovered by the secret police, who used these texts as corpus delicti in some church show trials. On this picture, we see the Pope. He gives a book to a monk. There is on the book is titled Směrnice. It means guidelines for the Vatican agents or for Vatican spies, and the communists mean these faculties as guidelines. And so the texts have been kept in the investigations files of some significant ecclesiastical persons in our security services archives in Prague. This is example of archive in Prague. These documents are completely identical with the version of the faculties kept in Archivio Apostolico Vaticano, not only for Czechoslovakia, but also, for example, for Romania or East Germany. Special faculties were created believing that the communist regime would only last for a few years. They were not tailored for the completely chaotic situation of the church in Czechoslovakia of the 1950s. Unfortunately, the weaknesses of these special faculties became soon apparent in practice. In most cases, the faculties were inapplicable due to harsh reality of life. Monasteries were closed, most ordinaries interned, active priests imprisoned, etc. Yeah. In such a situation, the permission to offer pontifical mass without episcopal sandals, tunicella, dalmatics, and gloves, if these episcopal vestments are not available, may seem ridiculous. In some cases, the interpretation of the text of the faculties was also unclear. But for the later hidden church or underground church or secret church, the faculty provided by the Congregation for the Oriental Church proved to be a fundamental one. The possibility to change rite. Now we say to change inscription to another church sui juris. This possibility under some simplified conditions with only the presence of the ordinaries, not of Apostolic See. It also regarded the permission to say Mass in another rite than that of the cleric. This is the ritualism. Felix Maria Davidek, who was released from prison in 1964 after 14 years and secretly ordained a bishop in 1967, came up with a very creative idea. Secret bishops who considered themselves to be the ordinaries of their groups were in contact with the Greek Catholic ordinary in Prešov in Slovakia, with whom they agreed to see to a formal transfer of married Roman Catholic men to the Prešov eparchy. These men secretly studied theology in addition to their civilian work and to the care for the family. Preceding the ordination, the wife gave her consent. The ordination candidate expressed the intention to change rite, was ordained, and subsequently obtained permission for ritualism. In this way, over 100 of married, deeply religious men were obtained to the priesthood during the communist era. After 1989, at last 14 sons of these married priests became Roman Catholic priests, and one a bishop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And now I invite to speak Dr. Markéta Doležalová from also Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in Prague. And she will be speaking about propaganda against Pope Pius XII as a part of anti-church politics in Czechoslovakia in the 50s.
So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me to express deep gratitude for having a possibility to be with all of us, of yours, and to share ideas and to present a small piece of my work, which is connected with the more broader project, which is coordinated by my colleague Stanislava Vodičková, who can't come here, but she's greeting all of us, all of you. So, during the 15th century, propaganda became a powerful weapon of all political systems, ideologies, states, and power groups. The fact that the importance of this weapon is still growing in our days, in connection, for instance, with the war on Ukraine, we are conceived at every step. The meaning of the word propaganda has shifted significantly. From the neutral Latin basis of meaning, which we encounter, for example, in the historical name of the Vatican congregation, Sacra Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, here rather in positive sense, like a spreading of the Catholic faith, The content of this term shifted to ambivalent to negative positions. In the current perception, propaganda is associated with manipulation and outright lies. Post-war anti-church propaganda supported the interests of the Soviet Communist Party. Stalin's propagandists produced brochures and articles that flowed all over the world, not only through the channels of the official news agency like TASS. They were spread also in many other ways, invisibly for the lay public interconnected, such as theater plays or literature of so-called facts and fiction. In them, a relatively small number of properly illuminated themes and topics were repeated in countless variations during the Second World War and even before it. Communist Czechoslovak propaganda drew from this source even before the war and during the post-war so-called Third Republic. This term refers to the period with so-called limited democracy and the regulated system of the National Front, that means some People's Front, consisting of several permitted parties, which the communists gradually infiltrated from May 1945 until the coup d'etat in February 1948, when they seized the power. Of the mentioned topics, the most used was the following. The Pope, or Vatican, was or is a collaborator of the Nazis or fascists, was or is an enemy of Slavic Eastern European socialism building states, and it's always supported reaction, including colonial racist imperialism, refused even if it had the means to do so during the Holocaust to contribute to the rescue of murdered Jews. The last of mentioned myth, as well as the most of the previous ones, can be disproved using sources from the Vatican archives. There are four types of sources. Firstly, the Pope's radio speeches and messages. Secondly, briefs to state representatives or representatives of ecclesiastical provinces. Thirdly, notes of the Secretariat of State. And fourthly, the reports from Vatican diplomats in varying countries, which contain many interventions in the benefit of victims of racial persecution. Of course, if there were positive results, it's rather difficult to document them. These are mainly private letters of thanks to relevant diplomats. For example, Angelo Roncalli, the future Pope John the 23rd, which was the apostolic delegate in Ankara during the war, or to Angelo Roto, nuncio in Budapest, from Jewish religious communities or individuals and groups. Most of the mentioned documents can be found in the edition of Acts and Documents of the Holy See in relation to the Second War or in the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The Soviet propaganda empire benefited from the traditional mistrust prevailing in the erstwhile Tsarist empire towards Catholics, including Eastern Rite Catholics, who were mostly non-Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, etc. These old negative sentiments were supported by the disappointment of overestimating the profits that the Bolshevik government hoped to gain from humanitarian activities of the Pope Pius XI. At the beginning of the 20s, during the famine caused by the consequences of the civil war in the Soviet Russia, the Kremlin expected great financial support from the aid organized by the Vatican, but of course not for the starving people, but for Bolshevik political needs. At the same time, this action was passed off as a cover for efforts to get the Russian Orthodox to convert to Catholicism. The Czech constructors of the anti-church policy and the propaganda that presented this policy and sought to justify it to the population, and at this point I will talk mainly about propaganda in the Czech part of Republic because the situation in Slovakia was specific due to different historical developments. Of course, this Czech propaganda used Soviet models and myths. In this case, the cartoon which showed my colleague helped me because and this cartoon was depicted all of this myth or legends. Vatican spy network or sympathies of papacy and especially Pius XII's original nuncio in Munich and Berlin in the 20s and 30s to the German nation and Nazism, etc. They also used much older negative narratives and stories created during the efforts to resurrect Czech national consciousness from the 19th century. According to them, the papacy contributed to the suppression of the Czech national reformation, Hasitism, to the defeat of the Czech estate uprising in 1621, which was a complete legion. They blamed the papacy for the suffering of the people on recatholicization performed on the auspices of Habsburg dynasty by Jesuit order in the 17th century. The papacy supported the Habsburg and a pro-German language policy in these legions. The animosities from the days after the creation of the Czechoslovakia in 1918 contributed to this traditional repertoire. The consequences of the Second World War and the different development in the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia from the conditions in the Slovak Republic added additional ammunition to the slanderous propaganda. Pius XII recognized this Slovak state represented by the President Catholic priest Josef Tiso. The mere fact of the reception of the ambassador of the Slovak Republic in the Vatican was misused to point out the Pope's alleged siding with the fascists. The words of support that Pius XII addressed to believers in Czechoslovakia after Munich Agreement and the Christmas messages during the war to protectorate were soon forgotten. Disappointment of the second Czechoslovak president, the diplomat and Masaryk's collaborator Edvard Beneš, at the insufficient recognition of the Czechoslovak government in exile by the Holy See was transformed into an unflattering post-war narrative. And all this marked negatively the image of the heat of Catholicism, despite the great patriotic efforts of Czech clergymen, monks, nuns, and lay people in the anti-Nazi resistance. The number of those persecuted and killed during the occupation are in the hundreds. The post-war Archbishop of Prague and later Cardinal Josef Beran was also a prisoner of the Dachau concentration camp. After the communist coup d'etat in February 1948, the regime relatively quickly dealt with the democratic political opposition. The Roman Catholic Church remained the only ideological opponent in the country, but from the point of view of the Czech comrades, it was a very dangerous opponent. The symbol of the unity of the Church as an institution was the person of the Pope. One of the main directions of propaganda campaign was therefore focused on Pius XII. In 1949 and in early 50s, it seemed that the communists had all the trump cards in their hands, a massive propaganda apparatus, dozens of journalists and writers working in the national and regional press, radio and film, and a special ministry of information under the leadership of Stalinist apparatchik trained during the war in Moscow. It was Václav Kopecký, perhaps the toughest Stalinist in the party. He always put the interests of the USSR above the interests of his own homeland. The Coordination Center of Anti-Church Activities was so-called Church 6, Církevní šestka, in Czech, an interdepartmental body uniting the heads of power ministries and leading party ideologies. In the years from 1949 to 1951, when the attacks of churches peaked, it met several times a month. Almost every second meeting of this body involved points related to propaganda actions. Media attacks on Pius XII and the Vatican culminated in so-called Chios affair, which produced the first post-war martyr for the faith, a local priest, and served as a pretext for the dismissal of the representative of papal diplomacy in Prague, which was Ottavio de Liva. Czechoslovakia didn't officially break off diplomatic relations with the Vatican. It just didn't maintain them. The anti-communist decrees of the Holy Office of June 1949 became a pretext for intensifying the campaign against the Church and the Pope. The first of them was specifically aimed at the situation in Czechoslovakia against the creators and supporters of the schismatic Catholic action, that means Actio Catholica, but a false one. The second decree declared the excommunication of all believers joining or supporting communist parties. I had to point that the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia had 1 million members at the time. A high percentage of them, some sources say even up to 80%, were baptized or practicing Catholics. A detailed analysis of propaganda brochures and newspaper articles will be the content of the written form of this presentation. Now, as an example, to give you an idea of the all-pervasive slander campaign, I will give a few samples selected from the Lidové noviny, the organ of the Czechoslovak Writers' Union, newspaper, popular especially among the intelligentsia. The Czechoslovak Episcopate complained in vain about the below-mentioned and similar invectives. Now I quote, "Such is the policy of the Vatican," that means the Pius XII, "support for the most reactionary regimes. Whining about war, hatred for any manifestation of progress, under the pretext of protecting Christianity, freedom of belief, it becomes more and more entangled in a work of intrigues, frauds, and wickedness. Far removed from Christ's teaching, and most of all from Christian love for one's neighbor." That's Lidové noviny from the April 1949. And other quotation, again from April of this year, entitled, "In what waters does the Vatican net fish?" A week ago, Italy celebrated the 5th anniversary of the consecration of Pope Pius XII of the priest. The papal anniversary was a welcome opportunity for open political propaganda. It's difficult to overcome the hypocrisy that is pretended to the people under the guise of celebrating the papal anniversary. While it speaks in great words about the rights of workers and criticizes the privileges of capitalism, he pursues a single goal: to make the Italian workers the defenseless slaves of Italian and therefore of American capital. Support for all reactionary elements, direct intervention in Italian and world politics. This is the true face of the Vatican. The quoted excerpt reflects the disappointment of the communists at the result of the elections in Italy in the same year, and the nervousness of the leaders of Stalin's Eastern camp at the signing of the so-called Brussels Alliance, which was a preparatory step to the creation of NATO. In these and many other texts, the Holy See, the Curia, the Pope, included under the term Vatican, are depicted as allies of the imperialists, the heads of American banks on Wall Street, American, West German, French politician, or even Francisco Franco of Spain. Influenced by the Soviet point of view, the vision of the world of the communist ideologists in Prague at the time of the beginning of the Cold War absurdly depicted the Holy Father as a founder of modern-day crusaders, paid for by American dollars. Communist propaganda spewed out hundreds of similar attacks in such a way that they permeated all levels of society. But adherents of materialistic atheism denied the spiritual dimension of the Church. This backfired on communist ideologies over the following decades. They failed to achieve their goal to discredit the papacy and the essence of faith to the faithful. Thank you for your patient attention.
Thank you very much. And now pleased to speak Dr. Beáta Katrebová Blehová from Nation's Memory Institute in Bratislava. And topic of her presentation is organizing the first centers of Slovak Catholics in exile in the context of the post-war pontificate of Pope Pius XII.
Immediately after the end of the Second World War, the restoration of Czechoslovakia and the establishment of the so-called People's Democratic Regime, with its docile attitude towards the Catholic Church, Slovak refugees of predominantly Catholic faith began to arrive in the war-ravaged Europe. In comparison with the number of the refugees and displaced persons among other Eastern European nations in 1945, so we see the numbers here on this picture. The highest number of refugees were the Ukrainians, approximately 2 million. So the number of Slovak refugees, which estimated up to 10,000, was not so high. Still, the historical setback of 1945 resulted in the first wave of political emigration in the modern history of Slovakia. This concerned not only individuals associated with the regime of the First Slovak Republic, but also members of the intelligentsia, university graduates, and students. The common denominator of this first wave of emigration for political reasons was the struggle against communism and for the independence of Slovakia. The arrival of the Slovak refugees in the capitals of Western Europe made it necessary to organize the first centers of social and spiritual aid, especially in Rome, but also in Paris, Madrid, Munich, and elsewhere. This was necessary because of the fact that the social situation of the Slovak refugees was very bad, especially of those who were owners of the Slovak passports and did not want to be recognized as Czechoslovaks. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, a very long name, you can see it here on the picture, which was established in 1943 as assistance to the victims of the World War II, and after its end offered help to displaced persons to return to their homelands. And from 1947, the International Refugee Organization, so IRO, did not take Slovak refugees under their care from the beginning. Only in the autumn 1947, when the former Slovak chargé d'affaires, Josef Kirschbaum, was recognized by the head office of the IRO in Geneva as the official delegate of the Slovak League in America, the situation began to change. After the recognition of Josef Kirschbaum, Slovaks were considered eligible and when put under the protection of the International Refugee Organization, which was an essential prerequisite for successful emigration, mostly overseas. Kirschbaum was in regular touch with the head office in Geneva and was the first contact for all Slovak refugees in need of material aid and support of their outward passage. So Slovaks were placed on the same level as other nations only in the second half of 1947. But it was necessary for them to submit to a screening procedure in refugee camps, which was usual, so that they could obtain a protection mandate under the IRO constitution. This practice was also continued after 1948, when after the February coup d'etat, much more refugees from Czechoslovakia came to the West. An important impulse for the organizing of Slovak Catholic diaspora in exile was the post-war pontificate of Pope Pius XII. Actually, we have not heard much about the crucial line of Pope Pius XII, but his pontificate was really important, and we should say some words about him. He had a clear anti-communist orientation, which we know very well. Pius XII watched with great concern the expansion of the Bolshevik New Islam from the East, as well as the Marxist secularization from the West. He understood communist ideology in the spirit of the encyclical of his predecessor Pius XI, Divini Redemptoris, as an essential perverse evil, intrinsecamente perverso, and he perceived the struggle with communism in an eschatological spirit as an apocalyptic struggle with evil. In the emerging bipolar world, so the beginning of the Cold War, nascent Cold War, also an important term in our context, it was not the question for him of belonging to one of the blocs, but the question of alliance with Christ, which he formulated in his well-known Christmas message of December 1947 in the following way. Our position, so this is quotation of Pius XII, our position between the two opposing sides is free from all prejudice, free from all preference for this or that nation, this or that state, just as it is distant from any consideration of a worldly character. To be with Christ or against Christ, this is the whole question. Pius XII was also well aware of the fact that the renewal of Czechoslovakia and its integration into the Soviet sphere of influence did not reflect the will of the majority of Slovaks, German, and Hungarian population, but that any alternative arrangement of Central Europe against the will of the victorious Allies was not possible. After the end of the Second World War, the centers of the Catholic Church, Rome, for a number of important reasons, became a refuge for thousands of immigrants from all over Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. One of the reasons was the powerful charitable and pastoral work of Pope Pius XII. You can see here the picture, Pontifical Auxiliary Commission, Pontificia Commissione di Assistenza, which was founded in April 1944 as an institution for the relief of refugees, political prisoners, and people in need. Many Slovak refugees ate daily at the famous Pope's canteen on Via Po, near Vatican, which was set up exclusively for refugees, where they could pick up a simple but hearty meal twice a day, without which many would have had a hard time surviving. Assistance to refugees including social and material security in the impoverished post-war Europe, not excluding financial aid, as well as assistance in emigrating overseas, which was also used by Slovak exiles. In particular, the Slovak diaspora in Rome played a key role. So I'm going to talk practically only about the Slovak diaspora in Rome. The first charity organization, the Social Welfare Center for Slovak Emigrants, which was established by Ignác Zelenka, you can see him on the picture, a lacy-sized Catholic priest who went to Rome as a young seminarian for theological studies during the interwar period. He lived and worked in Rome until his death, was a long-time librarian in Vatican Apostolic Library, and later a head of the cataloging department. He had a friendly relationship with the influential French Cardinal Eugène Tisserand, who helped him in his career. He published and edited the first Slovak Catholic magazine in Europe, founded and headed the Slovak Information Office, which provided news agencies with reports on the difficult situation of the Catholic Church in Slovakia. Another political center of the Slovak diaspora took shape around the former Slovak envoy to the Holy See, Karol Sidor. His name was mentioned already, who was granted political asylum by the Vatican at the end of the war until he left for Canada in 1950. Sidor's active diplomatic efforts on behalf of the persecuted Jews in Slovakia, his anti-German attitudes, and his support for the Catholic Central European Federation got him in contact with outstanding figures from the elite countries working in Rome, Christian democratic Italian politicians, among them the Prime Minister, the postal Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi, and so on, Guido Gonella, and so on, and diplomats from Central Europe, especially Poland and Hungary, Kazimierz Pape, for example. The Holy See tacitly recognized Sidor as Slovakia's representative even after 1945 and expected him to form a government in exile. Sidor spent the first 2 post-war years providing assistance to Slovak refugees, publishing articles in Italian and Slovak American press, and strengthening his diplomatic, political, and ecclesiastical ties. He was also part of the Pontifical Auxiliary Commission and made his car available for the 3rd Pontifical Mission for Refugees in Germany and Austria, which took place in the autumn and winter 1945-1946. The February coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia was the main reason why some prominent Slovak political émigrés grouped around him. In the autumn of 1948, the Slovak National Council the Slovak National Council in London was restructured into the Slovak National Council abroad with the program of anti-communism and struggle for national independence. The first chairman of the Slovak National Council abroad was Karol Sidor. The headquarters was at the beginning in London, later in Washington and New York. It had branches in some capitals as Rome, Paris, Madrid, Munich, Buenos Aires, and Montreal, and was officially supported by the main Slovak American fraternal organization in the United States, which counted approximately 600,000 Slovaks or Americans of Slovak origin. Another important objective of the Slovak National Council abroad was promoting the federalization of Europe and taking active part in the process. Sidor was familiar with the ideas of Pope Pius XII supporting integration processes in post-war Europe, provided that these be based on Christian principles, especially Catholic social teaching and the principles of solidarity, natural law, and human dignity. The Pope himself supported the emergence of Christian democratic parties. Another important point, a characteristic of Pius XII, his support for Christian democracy in the post-war Europe, and their integration into higher supranational groups. The most important of them was the federalist movement of Christian democratic parties, groups, and personalities founded in 1947 under the French name Nouvelle Équipe Internationale, which acted as European Forum for broad cooperation among Christian democratic parties to implement their programs. Sidor was personally acquainted with the new Secretary General of Nouvelle Équipe Internationale, Robert Pichet, a French politician, minister, and member of the leadership of the Republican People's Movement party, which became a member of the post-war French governments. Following the model of the Italian Democrazia Cristiana and the French Mouvement Républicain Populaire, so Pichet, Sidor founded the Slovak Christian Democratic Party and sought its admission into the aforementioned movement. After the communist coup d'etat in February 1948, a massive wave of Catholic emigration from Czechoslovakia began. Among the first prominent Catholic priests who came to Rome was the former editor-in-chief of the leading Catholic newspaper and director of the Central Catholic Office, founded after the war by Slovak bishops as an important instrument of evangelization and a part of Catholic action. Anton Botek. Immediately after his arrival in April 1951 in Rome, he gradually established the Slovak Catholic head office abroad and quickly organized around himself a group of young priests and religious. The head office should inform the free world about the persecutions of the Catholic Church in Slovakia and assist the social and spiritual needs of the Slovak emigration. From the beginning of 1952, the Slovak Catholic head office in Rome started to publish the magazine Voices from Rome as an organ of Catholic action. In the same year, Botek became the first Slovak representative of the Supreme Council for Emigration to the Sacred Consistorial Congregation, which meant that he was responsible for the care of Slovak Catholic missions, which in accordance to Apostolic Constitution of Pius XII, Exul Familia from August 1952, gradually began to emerge in the free world in the 1950s. At the beginning of July 1953, Štefan Náhalka, professor of philosophy, secretary of the Bishop of Spiš, Jan Vojtašák, and secret Vicar General of the Spiš Diocese, whom the Czechoslovak state security had not been able to find for almost 3 years, arrived in Rome after a distressing escape from behind the Iron Curtain. His theological education and linguistic knowledge surpassed that of Botek, and so it was natural that he took over the leadership of the Slovak Catholic diaspora, not only in Rome but in the whole free world. So he was the head, actually, he was the head of Slovak Catholic exiles. In September 1952, the first secret bishop of Jesuit line, Pavel Hnilica, arrived in Rome. He played a crucial role in bringing the crimes of the communist regime in Slovakia to the attention of the world public. Many other Catholic clergymen emigrated after February 1948 or remained in Rome due to the impossibility of returning to Czechoslovakia under communist rule. So Rome played actually a very significant role in Catholic diaspora. Now I tell some words about Hnilica because he was cooperating with Archbishop Gawlina, and this is maybe interesting for the Polish public. Immediately after Hnilica's arrival in exile, he began to prepare a detailed report on the situation of the Church in Slovakia for the highest ecclesiastical authorities, which he submitted to Pope Pius XII and the General of the Jesuits, Jean-Baptiste Janssens, in May 1954. One of the aims of this document was to overcome the reserved position of Pius XII on the extraordinary measures we were talking about and the faculties and so on, the building of the secret church structures taken by the church in Slovakia. In fact, the highest ecclesiastical authorities did not foresee the decision to establish the so-called Jesuit line of the underground church, which went beyond the framework of the papal instruction Nominatio Substitutorum of June 1948, which was the first extraordinary measure in order to build secret church structures. After patient explanations, and especially on the basis of Hnilica's report, the doubts about the secret bishops' consecrations, so there were already 3 secret bishops' consecrations in that time, were refuted. It was probably Pius XII himself who, by the force of his authority, decided to approve proceedings of the Church in Slovakia. The extraordinary faculties which the Pope granted to the Church in Slovakia were as extensive as the Holy See have ever granted, so were more extensive than the extraordinary faculties in the Soviet Union in the 20s. They laid the foundations of the underground structures of the Church, which lasted until the fall of the communist regime. The second aim of Hnilica's report was to motivate the church authorities to establish a center in Rome to deal with the question of communism and the persecuted church behind the Iron Curtain, make the Western world sensible for it, and seek means to help it. Hnilica preferred a theological interpretation of reality to a pontifical political one. He perceived the church more on a spiritual, mystical level and expressed himself in an apocalyptic manner, as evidenced by his frequent use of the expression the mystical body of Satan as a synonym for atheistic communism. Pius XII immediately accepted Hnilica's proposal to establish a center for the study of communism, and in the same year, 1954, he founded the Committee for the Study of the Silence Church, Comitato di Studi per la Chiesa del Silenzio, headed by the exiled Polish Archbishop Józef Gawlina, and Hnilica as secretary. From that moment on, a fruitful cooperation began between Hnilica and the protector of Polish Catholics in the diaspora, Archbishop Gawlina, a convinced anti-communist. Archbishop Gawlina, who lived in exile from 1939, believed that the preservation of the religious traditions of the emigrants would result in the formation of a conscious apostolate of the laity, which in the case of the liberation of the homeland from communist rule would make it possible to rebuild church structures weakened by communism. In 1951, Gawlina established a group of the representatives of the clergy from the East Central Europe named Unitas, which prepared a memorandum for the International Congress of the Apostolate of the Laity in October 1951 in Rome. The main testimony of the memorandum was that the destructive power of the communism was proven not only by the number of persecuted Catholics behind the Iron Curtain, but also by the attempts to undermine the role of Christian roots in the process of forming European nations. So the Unitas group should not only fight against the atheistic communism in the East, but also against the progressive Catholics in the West. It should encourage the Western world to manifest solidarity with the persecuted church as well as to show real character of communism. A Slovak priest in Rome, Anton Botek, and later Štefan Náhalka, as well as Bishop Hnilica, which was already mentioned, were members of Gavlina's Unitas group. Through Hnilica, Archbishop Gavlina started to cooperate with the Dutch Premonstratensian father Werenfried van Straten, who in 1956 established the organization Kirche in Nood, a well-known organization which helped priests and laity from countries behind being under Soviet rule. The cooperation between Hnilica and Archbishop Gavlina lasted until his death in 1964, and it also concerned joint speeches against communism during the meetings of the Second Vatican Council. As the last point, I would like to mention the movement of the Slovak Catholic students abroad, which started to be organized immediately after the arrival of the first Slovak students in exile after the end of World War II. The Association of Slovak Catholic Students Abroad, which was founded in the autumn of 1945 in Austria, and later established centers in Rome, Paris, Leuven, Madrid, and Montreal, was a continuation of the activities of the IPNtv head office of Slovak Catholic students as part of the transnational Catholic students organization Pax Romana, which intended to create integral Catholics. In the nascent Cold War, the Association of Slovak Catholic Students Abroad became again a member of Pax Romana. It took part on the congresses and was supported by some governments, especially in Spain, where the government of General Francisco Franco supported the exiles from East Central Europe. In the 1960s, the association has been transformed into the head office of Slovak Catholic intellectuals, and in this form survived even the collapse of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia and existed until 2011. So I will stop in this point, and I thank you for your attention.